Yes.
Okay. Hello.
Just a second. I'm going to just that string here. Okay. And then I will shut this up and begin.
All right. So, hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas Moyer. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, and it's a pleasure to host this webinar with so many people that have signed up today. I know there are even viewing parties, so even for the numbers of people we see joining this webinar, there are many more collected in rooms in different places. So welcome to this webinar where we're going to be talking about the Thrive Agenda. As you all likely well know, as you've joined this webinar, on June 4th in Vancouver, the Prime Minister of Canada announced a commitment to an increase in federal government contributions to reach $1.4 billion by 2023 in support of women and girls' health around the world. It's a 10-year commitment. It's funding that's intended to support, among other things, obviously maternal, newborn, and child health, and ring-fencing contributions to support sexual and reproductive health rights to the tune of $700 million. Together, these commitments are called the Thrive Agenda. And that's what we're here to talk about. This announcement was very widely celebrated by the sector, including by CCIC. And it's the culmination of really a concerted effort and really a broad coalition of advocates that worked together over well over a year and a half prior to this announcement to ensure that there would be ongoing investments in these areas. And so because of the enthusiasm around this announcement and because of what it portends for aid in Canada, from Canada, we felt it was important to have a moment to share what this announcement means and to answer questions from the broader sector, as well as talk about some of the lessons of what has been really a very successful advocacy effort by a subsector within our broader sector. So really our objectives today are to present the Thrive Agenda, the government commitments, work through what we know, what we don't know, where the work still remains to be done, and to share those top level process learnings. So to share this information with you are some of the champions behind the success of the Thrive Agenda. And so I will introduce them briefly in turn and ask them each to introduce themselves before we launch into things. And so we're joined for this conversation by Julia Anderson, who's the Acting Executive Director at CanWatch, as well as also from CanWatch, Megan Akins, who's Senior Stakeholder Engagement Advisor there. Sarah Kennel is Director of Government Relations at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And Lauren Dobson-Hughes, known in many capacities, is also Principal at LDH Consulting. So maybe I'll ask you each to say briefly a brief introduction of yourselves and sort of the role you played in the Thrive Agenda process. And Sarah, because you're in the room, I'll start with you.
Privilege. Thanks, Nick. And thanks to CCIC for bringing us together today. It's really exciting to take stock of what we've been able to accomplish and also work together as a sector to plan our next steps. So I'm Sarah Kennel, I'm Director of Government Relations and Campaigns for Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. And my engagement with this file, I guess, began in the lead up to Muskoka and when I joined Action Canada, which at the time was ACPD, in 2012. So it's a long kind of road and journey, and here we are. So happy to speak more about what that looks like in a couple of minutes.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Just because of the order you're on my screen, Lauren, perhaps?
Hi, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Dobson-Hughes. I was helping to coordinate all of the different organizations and players involved in the Thrive Agenda, as well as having the privilege to hold the pen and writing the policy document around which everybody eventually coalesced. So I'm sort of the facilitator, coordinator, and writer.
Thank you. Megan?
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And yes, echoing Sarah's many thanks to CCIC for really convening us here this morning around such an exciting moment. As I was introduced, Megan Aiken, Senior Stakeholder Engagement Advisor with the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, better known as CanWatch. My role really centered on a lot of the coordination within the CanWatch membership, working collaboratively as CanWatch is a member of the Future Planning Initiative to align and coordinate our efforts, and doing a lot of the political stakeholder engagement in advancing the Thrive agenda.
Thank you, Megan. Julia?
Hi, echoing thanks for organizing this. Very exciting to see such a large number of people interested in this work and interested in thinking about how to take the work forward in a meaningful way for the sector. So I'm Julia Anderson. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, as Nick said, and I've been in the role of Acting Executive Director for about a year, but have been with the organization for 3 years, just over 3 years now. So have been involved in this process since then, you know, in sort of a different capacity. But when I took the ED role for the past year, was playing sort of a larger part in the advocacy and high-level political meetings and whatnot. And it's been a fun ride that I'm very excited about to talk about with you.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. Un bref mot en français pour mentionner que ceux d'entre vous qui préféraient suivre le contenu en français, nous aurons un résumé qui aura lieu plus tard à 1h, heure de l'Est. Le lien pour se joindre à ce webinaire-là est disponible sur notre site web au ccci.ca dans la section événements. Donc, vous pouvez trouver le lien là. On va faire un résumé de toute cette conversation et avoir une opportunité pour une discussion et réflexion à 13h. Donc, trouvez le lien sur notre site Internet. So just very briefly before we get started, a couple of things. We will pause often throughout the webinar if you have questions, and we will be looking for those. For all participants, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to enter your questions. If you see questions posed by others you would like to upvote, please do that. We will make a point of going back to the questions as best as we can, acknowledging that we'll give as much information as we can, but there are also things we don't know. And so we'll be sharing and acknowledging those as well. We will be making room, particularly at the end, for a robust Q&A and back and forth. Our general sort of outline for this webinar will be talking about the historical overview. How did we get to where we are? And then we will talk about really what is Thrive. So what is in there? What does that mean? You know, what's been packed into that announcement? And then we're going to talk about what comes next. So there is actually, after the announcement, quite a bit to do to implement that, and a lot of questions remaining. So we'll be talking about those. That's the sequence that you can expect in this webinar. And really, to get us started will be Julia and Sarah to talk to us about that historical overview. How did we get to where we are? So we haven't decided which of you will start, but.
Sarah, do you want me to start?
Sure. Yeah, I can take us back in history. And I was thinking it would be important to cover kind of some of the significant milestones that occurred in the lead up to Muskoka and then since Muskoka until kind of now. And a few highlights for me at Action Canada include kind of the response that civil society gave at the time and the position of civil society, the community, in the lead up to Muskoka. And it was my feeling that the civil society community was sadly fractured and it wasn't aligned in terms of what it was asking Canada to do at the time. The advocacy space was challenging, and the entry points to engage effectively with government were also challenging. And as a result, you know, it was very difficult for civil society to remain aligned in many ways. And so as a result, you know, Muskoka happened, and there were many partners who felt like it was missing elements of the maternal, newborn, and child health agenda. And specifically, those issues had to do with kind of the more stigmatized issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights, including namely the explicit exclusion of safe abortion care initially, and which carried throughout the initiative, or at least until 2015, and also the initial exclusion of family planning. And so in response to those exclusions, partners like Action Canada leveraged kind of diverse advocacy strategies to try and hold the government accountable to what we believe are its human rights obligations to deliver a comprehensive and integrated package of services. And the strategies that we employed at the time were leveraging the media, so doing a lot of op-eds, trying to raise awareness among the Canadian public to those deficiencies within the initiative. A lot of sign-on letters that many of you joined on to, thank you. Also engaging opposition MPs was a big one, asking questions in question period, doing order paper questions, and trying to kind of hold the government accountable through parliamentary channels. We also had a WHO, World Health Organization, expert opinion, technical opinion provided in around 2011, 2012, which basically said, should Canada continue to exclude these issues, it will be going against the right to health and kind of best practice in that regard. So, and all of that coupled with also kind of trying to pressure Canada in intergovernmental spaces, because it wasn't only kind of Canada's exclusion of these issues through development assistance, but also in foreign policy. And so, at the time, Canada's position on SRHR and intergovernmental negotiations was quite weak. And it went so far as to, explicitly exclude gender references in those negotiations as well. So it was a very challenging time for SRHR, but also gender equality and women's empowerment more broadly. So leading up to the 2015 election, we were leveraging these strategies, and we really thought, okay, the election is a moment for us to seek commitments from parties on these issues. And in order to do that, we created the Future Planning Initiative, which Megan alluded to, and it was 6 organizations coming together with a common vision to strengthen Canadian leadership on sexual and reproductive health and rights beyond 2015. And those organizations included CCIC, CanWatch, Action Canada, Interpares, Global Canada, and Oxfam. And we continue to work together until now and into the Thrive advocacy that happened. But some of our initial activities post-election included bringing together experts, global experts from the SRHR community to Canada and say, we have a new government now. What is the opportunity before us to really solidify the position of SRHR within MNCH and within Canada's development assistance? And so we held a retreat, and from that retreat, we came out with some policy recommendations that we shared very actively with government and tried to encourage them very strongly to take them on board. We also invited the executive director of UNFPA to come to Canada, and that happened in 2016, and it kind of created some momentum around what the potential for increased leadership in this area could look like. And I think those key pieces kind of led to the initial success that we saw in 2017. So first being the 650 announced in March 2017 for SRHR, and Canada identified what those areas would be, or areas of support within that initiative. So it was $650 million beginning in 2017 over a 3-year period to kind of get us to 2020, when obviously there would be opportunity to look at a broader vision for Canadian leadership. And of course, we had the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which came out, which had a deep integration of SRHR as well. And so we had these big, milestones before us, or, immediately in our kind of under our belt. And so we held another retreat, the Future Planning Initiative in 2018, to look at where Canada could go next, specifically beyond 2020. And of course, CanWatch held its conference with that theme as well that same year in the fall. And so we had these big coming togethers of the sector, and also not just kind of the traditional folks. We brought in a lot of unusual allies, I suppose, in many ways, across government departments in Canada, but also globally, looking at the philanthropic sector, looking at the global financing facility, looking at private sector, to kind of input to what that vision could look like. And from those processes emerged further policy recommendations that really positioned us well to kind of come together as a community, I think, in 2018. So just to say, I'll finish here in a minute, but just to say that I think, the groundwork that was laid bringing us to 2018, I think is important to acknowledge that, this is a conversation, a piece of advocacy that's been underway for nearly a decade now, and one that has been challenging. Certainly many of us in the sector have felt the pains of what a fractured civil society community looks like, and what shifting access to government looks like, and how that can really hamper the success of an initiative, and also the true value in advocating from a position of unity and the strength that that brings. So perhaps I'll hand it over to Julia to kind of take us from there, but just to say it's been such an amazing process to be a part of, and one that I think should be unpacked a little bit to digest the lessons learned even further.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that's a great overview, and helpful also that you started with kind of the Muskoka pathway. So what CanWatch brought to the table, which is slightly different, is we're a membership-based organization, over 100 members, many of whom were the implementing organizations for the Muskoka Initiative. And I found it fascinating when I sat in the initial post-FIAP, so post-feminist international assistance policy meetings, in and around the time that the 650 million was announced, and had conversations with all the partners, the Muskoka partners. So there's, I think, 44 partners. And when they were, questioned by government, how are you implementing the FIAP? What kind of work are you doing? There was dual streams that came out, because a lot of organizations said, look, we integrate a holistic approach to reproductive health in all programming we do, because we're feminist, gender equality organizations who put that at the forefront. And we did that for the Muskoka, and we're just now talking about it differently. So saw themselves as closely situated within the FIAP, within the SRHR agenda, within the kind of progression of a comprehensive approach, and said, look, we're just going to essentially build our logical frameworks out in a different way because of this, and continue doing the great work we're doing. And then there was other organizations who said, no, we haven't taken an explicitly SRHR approach, an explicitly a gender equality lens, and we're now applying that and thinking about the best way to approach things with this different sort of additional lens. So there was definitely those two streams coming forward, and on the ground, what was happening, in developing countries, in the countries that our members worked in partnership with, was really amazing work, and really, in some cases, incredibly gender transformative work, incredibly, work that was guided and implemented with gender equality as the lens. And so what we saw at CanWatch was the opportunity to really both talk about things in a different way and drive better programming for organizations who weren't as far along. So that's kind of the programming background. But it also is a key advocacy piece, because one of the biggest challenges, and I always refer to David Morrison's book on CETA, so it came out in 1999, and he talks about government's ODA priorities being an overburdened Christmas tree, that every new minister and every new kind of deputy minister comes on and puts their ornament onto that tree, and eventually that tree becomes so overburdened by these different priorities and different concepts that it falls over, and it no longer, has the shape of a tree standing up to show at your Christmas party. And so I think about that, and I think about the way that CanWatch and Future Planning Initiative decided to approach this advocacy strategy was to say, look, there is a lot of impact being had. There is a lot of good work happening on the ground. We want to celebrate that. We want to tell the impact story of Muskoka, of the SRHR investment, of our work more broadly. And we're not going to shy away from that. We're not going to take in some ways, and I was, our partnership with FPI was so critical in this, but in some ways take the path of easiest resistance with working with governments, which is to say, you have all the great ideas, and thank goodness you're in government now, because now, we can do things the right way. The path, that's in some ways the path of least resistance from advocacy, to say, like, you've saved the day. We decided, I think very deliberately, and built the trust slowly to say, no, actually, there was a lot of good stuff. There was so much good stuff in Muskoka. It just was missing some components, and we need to be additional, not replacing the whole thing, right? Not coming in with, this is totally new, this is totally different, because you're the guys who can do it right. Rather say, no, Canada is having a tremendous impact and has the ability to be a game changer because of that impact, because of those pathways that have been built over 10 years over the Muskoka, the amazing Muskoka investments that are made. You have the pathways to achieve excellence. If you'll step in and step up and do more and do better and all that kind of stuff, and that's where that argument, but crafting out that narrative and coming to consensus on that narrative was incredibly challenging, because there is a tendency and a desire, I think a pull from government in some ways, to want to place the new and shiny thing in front of them and say, like, you know, if you just do this, you'll be good. And there's a desire, as Sarah articulated, there was people left out, and so they wanted to make sure from Muskoka, so they wanted to make sure that, in fact, it was not a watered down, we're just going to add a little bit. It actually was a fundamentally different approach that included the neglected areas of SRHR, what we call the pointy nose of SRHR, the difficult areas to talk about, and those needed to be simultaneously called out and identified as something new, while maintaining the narrative that we are having an incredible impact. So that was, I think, you know, we had different milestones. We had a conference, as Sarah spoke about, in the spring of 2018 called Beyond 2020. We talked about it then. We did a pre-budget submission. We had these various leadership roundtables, as well as open invite civil society partners roundtables, where it was literally just building up a listserv as we went along for people who wanted to come. It was a very porous group. So there was different techniques and ways that we started to build trust, but that tension point remained, and it remained, I would call, a healthy tension point, to say, let's never forget, let's never undermine or throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's never undermine the good work that's being done while trying to call on new and better work, but let's talk about it in a comprehensive way. So I think that was one of the tension. I always think about things in tension points. That was one of them. The other was the ability to build relationship with key political and government stakeholders before we knew what we wanted to do. And I think I'm largely new to the advocacy world, and continue to say, like, this is not my thing. This is not my, like, I am not a trained advocate. I'm not Lauren Dobson-Hughes, who's amazing in this space, a consultant. You know, I sort of am making this up as I go, and will continue to say that probably for the rest of my career. But in my learning journey on this, I think one of the key strategies, and I think this is important for CCIC and for your membership, you're told never to go to government without a specific ask. So we always felt 2 months behind because we were slowly building that trust and slowly building up the relationships in order to come together as a sector. We always felt like we were behind because we needed to get government on board simultaneous to building that trust and building those relationships. And so we needed to be able to say to government, like, we're working on something. I think it was January, or Lauren can correct me, but it was somewhere November, December, where we had been promising for so long that we are going to, like, bring them this document that would say what we had been working on all this time. And it was, sort of promised in September and delivered, I think, the day before Christmas holidays, maybe, or something like that. So there was a long stretch in there where we needed to keep them engaged and build the relationship pathways in order to actually execute on a very big ask once it was coming through the door. And one of the ways that we did that, I think, was by hosting different events, having different things where we're like, oh yeah, we're all working together. Can we get the minister to speak at this? Can we have a meeting that, is presumably about this event, but really we're actually just trying to build trust and relationship with key political stakeholders. And, Beyond 2020, our conference was kind of an exercise in that, but then CanWatch and our partners held, I think it was an unprecedented for us, number of events, September, October, November, December, where we were engaging key political stakeholders on the bureaucracy side and the political side. And I think this was helpful because then when we actually walked through that door with that big ask in sort of the January timeline, we knew people well enough. We had enough relationship that people opened the door to us, right? Which I think that latent relationship building is something I'm thinking a lot about for CanWatch and next steps. How do you, match the fact that no government person generally will meet with you just for fun? You have to be asking them something, you have to need something from them and have that hook, while you don't actually have an active ask on the ground. And I think CCIC and the membership can think about this, and sort of the next, whatever it's going to be the next ask, is how do we get bureaucracy and the high-level political buy-in to just show up and sort of be with us as a sector and see us as a sector as an ally. And I think we pulled off a couple things that they really liked, and they really were grateful and thankful to us for it, which were really comms and events related things. And that got us, you know, on a pathway. For example, we did this the most random event ever with Haley Wickenheiser, just an amazing event with Haley Wickenheiser in Calgary. It's called WickFest, and Nutrition International and CanWatch partnered to make it all about, like, you know, sport and women and gender equality and how that connects to international development. When you piece it together and think, like, that event sort of stood alone, but the Prime Minister came. So it was the first time we got to work with the PMO staff really directly, and got to meet people, got people's texting phone numbers, because it's like, when is the PM coming and how do we do this? Such a random event, but it was an investment. It was about, we spent about $25,000 from CanWatch on it. And it got us some of the names that otherwise we wouldn't have got. So the value of latent relationship building is something that I've certainly taken away from this. And then thinking about your different stakeholder groups, I think for CanWatch, so we are led by our Stakeholder Engagement Policy Working Group, which is a standalone working group that exists always. They meet monthly, Megan leads it. And the SEPWG is a key group. Then we have our board of directors, who are generally similar to CCIC's, CEOs and executive directors of a variety of organizations and research institutions. Then we have our broader membership, which not everyone is captured in those two spaces. And then we have our international partners. And Sarah alluded to this too, like, how do you pull all those levers at the right time? And how do you, again, coming back to another tension point, how do you make sure that people are in the know enough, that they're on board enough that they're going to kind of come with you, and you generally can claim consensus without expecting every organization to show up at the Thrive bi-weekly meetings every time, which would make those meetings too large and impossible, but also is burdensome, especially for a small and medium-sized organization who doesn't have a policy team, for example. And so I don't think we got this right. It's the one piece that I think we will do better next time, in kind of making sure that especially the broader membership is always informed. But thinking about those, doing that stakeholder mapping around, okay, you know, for us, there was the FPI, there was our SEPW, Stakeholder Engagement Policy Working Group, our board of directors, our broader membership, who we could access at certain points of time, our international partnerships, which we leverage, and when to pull those levers and work in broader spaces or smaller spaces is certainly something we've learned a lot about, and was a consistent tension throughout the process. We never took the Thrive agenda out and asked for organizational membership sign-on or sign-off. It was a much more porous document and needed to be porous throughout so that we could truly engage with government on it. And so we never said, like, sign on the dotted line, this is it, this is the finalized. It was always kind of a working document. And that maybe looking back, we would have at a key moment gone out for endorsement, maybe not. But I think that's just a tension worth noting, especially because we're with CCIC and you are a coalition-based organization. And I think we all struggle with getting this right. And there's probably, there's a little bit of failure and a little bit of success with any initiative like this, but certainly something that we're thinking about. So I'll stop there. I see that as kind of the history and the tension points and the milestones, and turn it back over to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Julia, and Sarah. There's a lot there to that history. I think, you've covered some of these points, and it's clear that over that history, you worked through a lot of tensions between your members, between the different stakeholders, how to please government stakeholders in that process, and some great insights there. I see some questions have already started coming, and that's great, and we'll get to those. But just before we move on to actually unpacking what the Thrive Agenda is, what these announcements are for, I'd love to hear also from Lauren and Megan, just what are some of the sort of top line insights that you have retained from that lead up to the announcement? What were some of the critical things that you thought were important ingredients in that recipe that led to the success of the advocacy effort? don't know which of you there.
I'll jump in. One of the things I have been thinking a lot about, first, I agree wholeheartedly with Julia about, I don't think the importance of like real, true, and meaningful relationships can be overstated. I think it's a really critical aspect of advocacy, but in terms of executing advocacy in this sort of realm where you're doing so on behalf of a coalition, broad, representing a broad range of organizations or members, it becomes incredibly difficult to sometimes wade through all of the advice that's being given, because I think everyone at one point has an opinion about how advocacy should proceed. And that ultimately, and I don't want this to sound cliche, I think what comes down to is being sure that you're always representing perspectives or strategies that you're being asked to represent, but also executing advocacy in a way that is true and authentic to who you are as an advocate. And so there was times that I think Julia and I've been doing advocacy for a long time in different spaces, but that we were taking an approach that was a little bit novel to how, or at times more collaborative than people would have liked, or taking a different approach. And ultimately, though, it was authentic to who we are as advocates. And I think that that is largely attributable to why we saw success, why we will continue to invest in the relationships that we've built to ensure that Thrive is fully and robustly implemented. But that's sort of been a takeaway for me, is that just coming back to being authentic to who I am and what makes sense, while also balancing that with the representative approach that's needed in this type of environment. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Megan. And yeah, I definitely echo the relationship building. And that was sort of, for me, coming in as you sort of heard, there'd been a variety of different conversations, conferences, working groups, but they were quite disparate. And it was clear something was bubbling up, maybe early 2018, and that people were seeing an opportunity. But it wasn't clear that there was the capacity within the sector, which was very, very divided, to seize that opportunity. So lots of these kind of different conversations, but quite isolated, some connected, some not. And so really for me coming in, one of my keys was, my job was to get everybody on the same page with a evidence-based progressive policy that we could see advocating for together. And so to do that, my big takeaway was I and everybody needed a full understanding of where everybody was at. What were the dynamics like? What was the landscape like? Who's got what interests organizationally, topic matter, pressures internally? Because it's fine if your organization doesn't have the capacity to engage heavily but wants to be kept informed. That's great, I can accommodate that. But I needed to know, who really wants to do a heavy lift on this? Who wants to contribute a lot of expertise on the SRHR side? Who's still feeling really unsure and uncertain about this process? So not just the topic matter, but literally people's feelings, investing in those relationships and in people. Because until you do that across the sector, you don't know whether it's, for example, worth bringing in somebody like me. In this case, it was, because the sector was so divided. They needed, I think, a neutral party just to facilitate and have those conversations. So really, yeah, the keys for me were the openness and the honesty, that it's fine to have an organizational interest or a need or a hurt feeling. Let's just get that out on the table, and then we can accommodate it. And at some points, it was really letting the group self-drive collectively and encouraging the group that I'm not dictating anything, neither is anybody else. This is your collective hive mind decision. So if you want the process to look different, great, go for it. Let's amend the process, because the process is as important, in fact, more so than the eventual policy. If people don't see themselves reflected in a process and they don't feel it has been fair or transparent, then it doesn't matter how good your policy is, people will not buy in because they've not seen themselves reflected in the process. So at some point, you know, I'd said, I think we should have a workshop. And just to throw it out there, and people had said, no, we want the working level workshop before the CEO. And other people had said, no, the other way around. We need our CEO buy-in for the process before we have a working level. And so we just went back and forth, and the conversations at times, I think, felt a bit chaotic or a bit unstructured, but learning to live with that fluidity and lack of structure was itself part of the process. And again, like everybody has said, it builds that trust and it builds the relationships. That if people can learn to trust you and they can understand that you are genuinely trying to get them and meet them where they're at, even if you've had tension in the past, even if organizationally you've not previously agreed, if they can see that you really want to understand what's your blockage with this, what can I do to meet you in the middle, and having that back and forth. And that applies not just within the sector, but to government as well. So as Julia says, we were sort of paving the road as we drove on it. And so we had one parallel track as a CSO coalition developing a policy, but at the same time, I was liaising with government trial ballooning. I think sometimes as a sector, we spend all our energy putting together this absolutely perfect policy that has taken us 6 months, and we laminate it and we sign on, everybody signs on, and they send their logos and their CEO signatures, and then it's locked down. And then we go to government and we say, here you go, this is our final offer that we're coming to you with for the first time. And government says, well, I mean, it's not too bad, but we've got this issue here, and there's one thing here we're curious about. But then you have no capacity to go back and alter that because it's laminated and you've engraved it in stone. So we were running a parallel track where we were trial ballooning with government as we went on a trust basis. It takes a lot of trust and relationship building to say, we're thinking as a CSO coalition about this idea. What do you guys think? That doesn't mean it's off the table if government doesn't like it, but at least then you know where the landmines are for government and you're co-developing. And as you're doing so, you're bringing them in, you're knitting them in and giving them skin in the game in the policy process. So by the time you get a final policy, which we never said was final, it's still a draft. It's version 19, but it is still a draft. The government has felt that at least for the first, from version 7 to 19, they have been involved in that. That didn't mean we accommodated every single one of their requests. It didn't mean that we went ahead with things they didn't like or did. It just meant that we were sort of co-developing and we were each aware of where we were all at. So yeah, I will say openness, honesty, transparency, knowing where everybody is at. And then finally, I'd say, while appreciating people's organizational interests, a collective pressure to put some of those interests aside. Not everything you are working on needs to be in the Thrive document. It is not a bucket list. And so working to build that trust to say it is fine for you organizationally to work on X, but collectively, we have decided that it's not currently part of the Thrive agenda. And so helping organizations message that internally, you can still work on it, you can still be funded for it, but just our collective vision currently is this, and your one particular issue sits outside it at the moment. So yeah, I will leave it there and maybe we can turn to some questions or.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lauren and Megan. There's, I think, a lot of insights there, and there's so much underneath the surface with respect to, the tactics you would have used. It's really, I mean, I take away from everything I've heard that in this process, you made sure that everyone that had a stake in this could in some way see themselves reflected in the process and know where they could connect along the way. I've seen some questions come up. I'm conscious of time. We do want to really unpack what the Thrive Agenda is. I want to say some of the questions that are about how can we talk about SRHR? What are some of the challenges about talking about legal abortion in environments where there is no legal framework? These are important questions, but they're not what this webinar is about. And so what I do want you to do, though, is use the chat function in Zoom. We are collecting information about what to do next. And so about the next steps, I mean, we'll collect them in the Q&A function too, but we really do want to know from our members what you want next out of these conversations and what could come. And so we're not going to lose those, but we can't really go into those details here. I think that there are a few other questions. Mark, could you go back? So around the changing political landscape and how we're going to preserve gains if there are changes in leadership. And I think that's certainly something that's relevant with us going into an election. And there's a question about where the $1.4 million will go, and concerns that some of this may be gobbled up by multilaterals. That question, I think we will address in the next section in part. And with respect to preserving our gains, if I may, I'll suggest we push that to the end because that's also about the future. It's where we're going. So questions well received, keep adding them in there. But we'll move on to really defining what this announcement means, what is in there. And we're going to be asking Megan and Sarah, but maybe we'll start with Megan, to sort of unpack what is this announcement? What does it mean?
Thanks so much, Nick. So I think firstly, we've talked a lot about process, and without going too far into detail, I'll just give some broad overview about what the resulting policy document, which formed the basis of our advocacy, actually was calling for, because I think that it's important then in the context of the announcement itself. And so what is the Thrive Agenda? Essentially, as a result of this really collaborative, open, at times fluid process, we reached consensus at the end of November 2018 on a document that would later become the policy platform known as the Thrive Agenda. And what it was really a series of feminist, integrated, gender transformative policies and programmings that took a comprehensive approach to women, adolescent, and children's health to enable Canada to deepen the impact that we were already having. And it really saw the intersection of health and rights as foundational, that the journey to a woman's empowerment starts early at the earliest days of her life, and it starts with her right to good health. And really approaching the way in which Canadian programming is rolled out in a way that layers the interventions that she needs throughout her life, that life cycle approach to reach that empowered moment. And it was divided into 3 streams. And so we were cognizant of one of our core mandates was to, in some respects, de-siloize the manner in which Canadian funding had been structured up to this point. So really that division that we've spoken about between the MNCH work of Muskoka, the layering on of the SRHR work in 2017, and thinking about it differently. So I think what is right off the bat really important to articulate is that although we've identified 3 streams within the Thrive Agenda, that these were never intended to be sort of siloed pots of funding, but really the coalition's way of indicating to government general allocations of funds to really maximize Canada's impact. And so the first was the Renew, and we were had advocated for an amount of $780 million per year out of the 1.4. And this was really building on the base of excellence Canada had in reproductive, maternal, newborn, adolescent, and child health. There was the lead stream, which is the 500 million that we identified as being needed to ring fence for the 4 neglected areas of SRHR, which we identified as comprehensive contraceptive care, adolescent SRHR, including comprehensive sexuality education, safe abortion care, and then as well advocacy for SRHR. And the third stream was accelerate. And this was areas that we really felt that Canada was uniquely positioned to build on our reputation for driving progress in critical gaps. And this includes a comprehensive adolescent health package in addition to the adolescent SRHR. Investing in grassroots advocacy for change, as well as making really intentional investments on data and the measuring and evaluation mechanisms. So that was sort of the agenda that we were advocating for. And then, so of course, as Nick alluded to at the top of the webinar, on June 4th, Prime Minister Trudeau stood on stage at Women Deliver and made a really exciting and monumental announcement. And I've pulled the language because I think it's just really important, you know, to unpack the language itself as it was announced. And essentially, he said that the Government of Canada will raise its funding to reach 1.4 billion annually, starting in 2023, to support women and girls' health around the world. He indicated this would be a 10-year commitment. And in both the media release as well as the short, I don't even want to call it a background or supplemental information that was provided, there was indications given that they were indeed adopting and endorsing the sort of comprehensive approach that is articulated in the Thrive Agenda. As a really core part of the announcement, he announced that 700 million of the annual investment would be dedicated to sexual and reproductive health and rights as of 2023. So there's a few important points, I think, to recognize here about what we know and what we don't know. I think right off the bat, the starting in 2023, I know on June 4th and the days that followed, caused a little bit of confusion, chaos, and misunderstanding about what it meant. And there was immediately, a lot of questions about what about the years from 2020 to 2023? What does this mean? With funding sunsetting and this not beginning till then. So I think what's really important to recognize is that the language was intended to signal that there would be a ramp up from 2020 to 2023 and that the ramp up would be reached by that year. So in discussion since, we understand that starting in 2020, the initial investment will be at 1.1 billion and that will increase over that 3-year period. What's important also to recognize is that we have yet to receive clear indication of what that ramp up will actually look like. So that's, in terms of what we don't know, that's a really clear area. You know, we've been given signals that it won't be the sort of 100 million each year, as it might logically make sense, but as money comes into the fiscal framework, it will be allocated to this Thrive announcement. The second part of what we do know is that although so there's two aspects in terms of money in the fiscal framework. So this is taking from unallocated resources within the international assistance envelope, largely drawing on announcements made in budgets 2018 and 2019. So is not being reallocated from other action areas, but in fact, pulling from unallocated resources. It is not, however, new money to the overall international assistance envelope, and it will not change our ratio in terms of gross national income. And I think I can leave it there. I know that there's, in terms of what we don't know, further is we really don't know much more than what was in a total of 3 pages of documents that were published on June the 4th. So outside of the media release, as well as that supplemental information, we don't have any more policy discussions, no clear sense of what aspects of the policy will be, have been implemented and integrated into the implementation of the Thrive agenda. The last piece that I will just flag, and it's indicated in both the Thrive agenda as well as the documents that were released by government, and that's really around the international and multilateral organizations. And I think this was one of the questions posed as well. But in the Thrive agenda, we always said that it was taking a comprehensive sector, a full envelope approach to Canada's spending on global health, that it would include dollars to be programmed out through Canadian and international partners, as well as Canada's pledges and contributions to the large multilateral organizations, including the Global Fund, the Global Financing Facility, Gavi, and GPEI. And so, but what the Thrive agenda did not do is determine specific allocations to any of those areas. We were really consciously and intentionally structuring it in such a way that was this large holistic approach to the envelope, but did not delve into those specific allocations. And I'll stop there because, Lauren, I know that that's a really key aspect of the next steps.
Yeah, I just wanted to add specifically on that question of multilats. So when the case was built, I costed it. So if you're building an investment case, you generally need to cost it, and should. And that was part of the appeal. The case, a large reason for the success of the case, as Sarah said earlier, is the unity. But that unity applies both to the Canadian CSO sector, but also the inclusion of multilaterals. It would not have been successful, I don't think, or we would have had very significant challenges if we had said, this is Canadian aid funding, and they'd said, but what about all of our billions of dollars for the multilaterals? And we'd said, oh, I don't know, we haven't figured that in. So we costed in the multilats at a modest increase, which is traditionally what all donors do. That was part of the success of the case, that we were able to say then, when Global Fund advocates turned up, government said, oh, is this another ask? And we said, no, we've costed that all out, don't worry about it. We've got it all in ours. And that made it much easier for government, knowing that a nominal increase had been included. And I do want to slightly challenge the tone of one of the questions, because in fact, actually bringing the multilats into that case actually allowed them to advocate for the Thrive Coalition. So we shared the case quite early on with the multilats once it had been agreed by Canadian organizations. And to their credit, because they had skin in the game now, if the multilats wanted their contributions, the multilats had to come out and advocate for Thrive. And to their credit, they did. They built it into all of their talking points on visits. They raised it in every meeting they had. So I do want to challenge the idea that they turn up later and cash in. I also want to say, impact was huge for us when Megan was talking about each of the streams of the case. The whole case is predicated on impact. So not what do we want from government, but what collective impact are we going to have on the lives of women and children? And sometimes in the sector, because we confuse our own organizational resource mobilization with advocacy, we think we've got this mindset that it's about the call for proposals that we need, which absolutely. But when you're advocating with that big umbrella group, we flipped it to what is the impact that the sector's going to have collectively, and how will the funding and the policy, not just the money, contribute to that. And multilaterals are part of delivering impact. So they were part of the case, and we expect, as I'll talk about in the next steps, some of that multilateral funding to flow along with the bilateral and CSO funding. So I'll just stop there.
There's so much, with respect to the announcements that I think is significant. One of the things that perhaps we could speak a little bit more about, and we'll go through the questions in a moment, but so there was an ask for 500 million to be ring-fenced for SRHR, but the Prime Minister's announcement was 700 million. Mm-hmm. Do we know why that's different? Could you perhaps speak to that? There is the, so what assurances do we have that the Thrive agenda really is what was announced? Because actually the announcement isn't really Thrive. It aligns, uses the same language. I think that would be a question also that I'd love to hear thoughts on.
I can jump in on the 700 for SRHR, my understanding of it. And I think, Nick, your point is spot on when we say, is this Thrive? I don't know. Yes, I would hope that this is kind of the reflection of months and if not years of advocacy that's taking place. And I think speaking to the trust issue that was built up with global affairs at the departmental level as well as the political level, our, I think, working understanding is that, yes, this is Thrive, if not using the term Thrive. And I think what is reflective of that is the language that's used to describe what is actually included, at least in the SRHR 700 million announced in June, earlier this month. And if you look at the listing of services that would be included in a comprehensive approach, it includes not only the 4 neglected areas that Megan spoke to, which is what the Future Planning Initiative advocacy has been based upon, but also reproductive health services and sexual and gender-based violence. And what was described to me prior to the announcement is that the reason it's 700 and not 5, which was advocated for by the Future Planning Initiative for the 4 neglected areas, is that it encompasses around 200 million, which is kind of Canada's annual spend, baseline spend on SRHR outside of the neglected areas. And so that's where we're picking up kind of the adjacent programming that brings that comprehensive integrated approach to the delivery of quality SRHR programming. When and how we're going to reach that 700 million within the time frame, I think is what we need clarity around now. But that's my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to give a bit of a tangible example of why we believe this is Thrive in all of its glory is, when the minister, we had the level of relationships that when the minister, so she delivered the news to me because I ran into her at a hotel lobby waiting for her staff at 11 o'clock at night. And the minister said, this is it. This is everything you asked for. We found a way to make it happen. We're so excited about Thrive and everything it's going to look like for the next 10 years. We've got it all, right? So the minister believes that this is Thrive and that this is what we asked for, civil society asked for. The department, some of those tension points I think that Sarah was raising is like the actual implementation now falls on the department, and civil society has to hold government to account for all of that. And some of those conversations need to continue to roll out. That's phase 3. And I think we have a lot of trust and goodwill in the department to do what it is. And we have the ministers seeing this as our vision being played out. So we can use that, I think, to ensure that, in fact, Thrive is Thrive is Thrive. And this is what it looks like. And this is how it's going forward.
Okay. Just another question. I think just if we could unpack a little bit more for everyone who's on this call, just that, you said, Megan, that we're looking at a ramp up to 2.4 billion, that this is built on the allocations, unallocated elements of the 2 billion in the budget last year. So do we have confirmation there is no new money in here, or is there? And when would that come in?
Who's answering?
Okay. So, as part of the next steps, I would say a lot of things are up in the air at the moment. The way the Thrive announcement finally came together at the very end, while we were all in Vancouver attempting to coordinate over WhatsApp with 11 p.m. meetings and midnight phone calls, that there is a lot still left to nail down. There is what we believe as a coalition, and we will be holding government accountable to. But there's also, so in terms of the new money, at one point they did think there was new money. The issue of the election still looms large, because, you know, they have taken money from inside the international assistance envelope that is unprogrammed. So to answer one of the questions, it's not just replacing one Christmas ornament with another. This is money that is not taken from any program area. It's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. That money is not increasing ODA, no. However, just looking at the fiscal framework and looking at, you know, the financial documents, I don't see how after, say, one election or two, they continue to afford this without new money. So that's just my personal opinion as the person who wrote and costed the case. But again, that's up in the air, and it's part of the next accountability stage. That the case said, this, we need some new money and this must contribute to an increase in overall ODA. And I think we're still committed to trying to hold them accountable to that as best we can, as you can't force them to do it. But that's part of the next steps. Does that sound fair, everyone?
Yeah, I mean, they needed high-level sign-off because all this money is new to the fiscal framework. So it's not new to the international assistance envelope, but they needed we understand that they needed PM sign-off, finance department sign-off, because this is new money. And it should, I would estimate in 2023, it should bump the envelope up, but it doesn't bump it up in 2020. And so I think that's where they don't fully know the answers, we don't fully know the answers, but the logical train seems to lead us in the direction of there is some new money at some point for this, and they did need the level of sign-off that wasn't just the minister saying, I'm reprioritizing. No, it was like, this is a new money to the fiscal framework, permanent 10 years, and we needed to get the full number signed off on.
Okay. Just because we're on the topic of numbers, there was a question about, could you speak to the percentage increase that was built in for the multilateral commitments? There's a question there related to the Global Fund and the ask that's out right now. Is that?
I built in a modest increase, and the costing, exactly how it's done, is my secret formula. I'm vegetarian, but it's my equivalent of whatever the KFC formula is. Because it doesn't serve anybody to, part of the reason that we got unity was this collaborative, here's the number, here's a level of depth that the minister needs, that PMO needs, that GAC needs. If we go any further into like, how much exactly for nutrition, how much exactly for Garvey, we will start losing people. So I did that level of depth for me to cost it, but that level of depth was not in the case. The Global Fund was at 785 million for the 5th replenishment, 2016 to 2019. The civil society ask this year is $1 billion. That I think is, from our calls, is acknowledged to be unlikely. But so you're likely looking somewhere in between 785 and 850, I would guess. But that's all costed in, all built in, and does not take away anything from the bilateral funding. The whole point of this was there is enough funding for everybody to do their work. Everybody gets a modest increase, and SRHR gets its own specialized component.
Okay. Now, there's a question that asks about accountability frameworks, and I think that's a good segue for us to the next part of the conversation, because fundamentally, we've just got, an announcement, but we need to action that, and there's a lot of questions, some of which you've alluded to. A lot of this will start to be answered through the accountability framework that does get put in place. And so let's talk about that sort of next stage of work. I think we asked Lauren to kick us off on that conversation. So what comes next with respect to the Thrive advocacy work?
So yeah, as I hope you've sort of understood by now, that this process was several years long in the making, and then the actual phase that we've just come out of was really at least a year. So 6 months policy development and 6 months GR and advocacy on the policy. And then the work doesn't stop just because the announcement was made. As you've heard, there are large gaps. There are also differences in understanding about what was announced. And this is typical. This is normal advocacy. There is nothing, unique to Thrive in this. What we've done is lock in a political commitment, as well as a political commitment to the funding. And as you heard Julia say, the minister herself is very committed to what's in the Thrive agenda. So not just the money, which is obviously something, but it's important to the group that the policy, so the principles that we outlined, gender transformative, feminist, holistic, community-owned and led, etc., are followed. So really we're now into a whole new phase of advocacy. We're still working out as a coalition what that means. We've started to identify some work streams to pull out, but it's a bit less of a unified effort now, and it's a bit more specialized as we deal with implementation, accountability, data, SRHR specific expertise. The risk is we get Thrive in name only. So the risk is the bureaucrats say, look, this is a lot of work to integrate and to implement. We'll just keep doing what we do, and the minister will never know, and we'll roll out the money because that we can has to be accounted for. But we won't really do integrated programming. That's too much work. We'll just pinkwash it. It won't be terribly feminist. So there's a real risk that we lose the policies and principles behind the policy while the funding rolls out. So the next phases of work really are this broad piece around implementation, and there was one question around accountability frameworks, and yes. So as we developed the Thrive policy, kind of in conjunction with political and bureaucratic sides, we're hoping to develop a full accountability framework in conjunction with political and bureaucratic sides. We're hoping to lend the significant expertise across the sector to that, and it will be a different expertise to the advocacy GR type hats or the high-level policy subject matter hats. It will be really the nitty-gritty of how do you program in a holistic way? How do you program in conflict and fragile contexts? What does safe abortion care look like where it is legal? That kind of questions. One of the lessons we pulled out of Muskoka, and that was really challenging to the Thrive Collective, was that we could not prove impact from the Muskoka money. So Canada spent nearly $6 billion on really great stuff, and we know at an individual project level, it was massively impactful. We couldn't show that, and GAC couldn't show it. How did we move the needle on even like maternal mortality rates in Kenya? How did we move the needle on SDG 3.1? What was Canada's contribution to, building latrines in schools to impact girls' education? We couldn't prove any of that, and that was a huge barrier for the Thrive case, because you're asking them to essentially double their funding, and you're not being able to tell them what impact they will have, and the difference between output, condoms distributed, and impact, abortions prevented, maternal mortalities reduced. So we really want to focus on that impact and the data piece. So we need a framework. We also need to know what counts and what doesn't, as in particularly for the SRHR money. So there was the ring fencing of these 4 neglected and stigmatized areas. And kind of what, as Megan said, what we did, for those who can see me, I'm holding up 2 hands. One is MNCH and one is SRHR, and they were previously pretty standalone. We shredded them into bits and put them together like this. I am now latticing my hands in like a kind of together. So we integrated them in a way where hopefully the SRHR, while it stands alone in the neglected and stigmatized areas as a call out and a funding ring fence, it is integrated where it needs to be into full programming. So that reproductive part particularly laps right over maternal and newborn, while the neglected and stigmatized areas have their own ring fencing. So what goes into that ring fencing really matters. We don't want them to put general midwifery care into the neglected and stigmatized areas of SRHR. We would consider, I think, Sarah, please nod at me if that's the case, we would consider that to be not aligned with Thrive. It is not a neglected and stigmatized area as named in Thrive. We would, however, like them to put part of our education programming where it relates to comprehensive sexuality education into the neglected and stigmatized areas. So we've got a lot of that kind of accounting sub-level DAC coding to do so that we're in agreement when they report back to us and we hold them accountable, what counts as SRHR and what doesn't. We have some work to do on assuring that the ramp up and some of those missing pieces that we don't know yet, what exactly is the ramp up, so we can hold them accountable for getting money out the door. We do not want them to be sending it back to Treasury at the end of the year because they couldn't spend it. We did not go to all this work to get the money for them to let it lapse. Then sort of more in the immediate term, the short, small piece to answer one of the questions is the call for proposal that was announced by the minister. So that's $325 million to CSOs over 5 years, so 65 mil a year. In a way, as someone alluded to, is a bit of putting the cart before the horse, because ideally you would want the full funding framework, the full accountability framework agreed first before they start spending money. In this case, they're likely going to start spending money, or at least penciling it in and signing contracts before the framework is agreed. So that represents a bit of an accountability challenge, but acknowledging that a lot of the funding will sunset early next year. And so if there is not a call for proposals out the door this summer, there will be a gap in some programming, so fully appreciate that. It's just a bit of a tension point for us to work with. And that call for proposals will be a bit of an indication to us as to what they're prioritizing. Like, is the call for proposals going to be that really holistic, integrated approach? Is it going to be about, like, you know, feminist grassroots rights piece? Is it going to be those hard edges of the SRHR piece? Because that's going to be an indication to us where GAC is thinking. And obviously the Thrive group, there are organizations within who will be looking to focus on influencing that call for proposals. And then just finally, the election issue. Yes, you know, what we got was a political commitment, and a fairly meaningful one, I think. I think it's going to be very difficult to walk that back for a next government. But as advocates, you know, there's always this tension between, we want to say X is not acceptable to us, and it's not acceptable potentially, but we're not in charge. Nobody elected us. So government will do what government does. All we can do are put in place roadblocks, incentives, lock-ins, accountability to make it as difficult as possible for any future government to renege on this promise. Doesn't make it impossible, but I think we feel that because the SRHR is so integrated into the full Thrive case, like it's in every stream, it's a bedrock piece, the principles are there, it makes it very difficult to pull alone, as opposed to if it was a bolt-on, just a sort of added extra piece, then it's pretty easy to pull off. We've been working with the Conservatives as well to help over the past few months bring them into the case and help them understand why it's so important. We've been reaching out to progressive women within the Conservative caucus to help align them, and again, trial ballooning each of these pieces to sort of knit them in. It's not perfect, but I think, and Sarah, maybe you want to speak to this, I feel relatively okay at the moment that we won't lose the SRHR piece, but that will be part of the ongoing work and the ongoing pressure that the sector needs to keep putting on should the stripe of government change. So maybe, I don't know, Sarah, do you want to add to that?
Sure, thanks, Lauren. And I think this kind of weaves through a few questions that have been raised throughout the webinar. But I think what's important to reflect upon is that my impression of the political landscape right now is that there isn't significant divide between particularly the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party on SRHR, or at least not publicly stated, beyond certain issues regarding funding for abortion care. But even that, I would say, is up for debate now within the Conservative Party. And I think reflective of that is the comment that Lisa Raitt made while she was in Vancouver at Women Deliver, which was, you know, if Canada really cared about this, they would have announced the ramp up before 2023. And I think that's just reflective of the fact that they don't take issue with the substance of the announcement, but rather are trying to kind of find another way to critique the announcement, which is, I think, positive to me. And the strategy in response to that, the room that's created at a political level with that response is twofold. And one, I think, is the work ahead of us now is vis-a-vis Global Affairs Canada and ensuring that they have the capacity and expertise they need to meaningfully program in the SRHR neglected areas. And just to let you know, the 4 areas are safe abortion care, comprehensive contraceptive care, adolescent SRHR with a focus on comprehensive sexuality education, and advocacy, specifically law and policy advocacy work related to create enabling environments for the exercise of those rights. And more information about those neglected areas can be found on futureplanninginitiative.ca or 18millionwomen.ca, the same number of women and girls in Canada in 2017, which is why we had that target figure. By investing in the neglected areas, you will empower 18 million women and girls around the world. There's the engaging GAC across those neglected areas, ensuring they have the capacity. And then the second piece is, as Lauren referenced, is engaging political parties across the political spectrum and ensuring that they are well briefed on this issue, that they understand the issue fulsomely, and that we avoid falling into the pitfalls of kind of abortion as a wedge issue, which I don't think is helpful. And just on the issue of abortion and in response to one of the questions, I think it's important to clarify that abortion is legal in the vast, vast, vast majority of countries around the world. It's only a handful of countries, and I mean handful, like less than 10 around the world, that fully criminalize abortion. In all other countries, it's restricted, but usually permitted to save a woman's life or for health-related reasons. And so it's really important to acknowledge that abortion is going to happen regardless of the legal context. It's the issue is it going to be a safe abortion? So how can we reduce maternal mortality by ensuring access to safe abortion? And then working on the law and policy advocacy to ensure that we're creating the enabling law and policy environments so that those laws can be overturned where they are discriminatory or leading to unsafe abortions. So I know this work is really hard. It's a challenging issue to deal with, but where I've seen the most success in dealing with it is when we've made linkages across issues, which is in the spirit of Thrive. So when we talk about, LGBTQ plus rights, making the linkage with abortion activists, when we talk about gender-based violence and the women's rights movement working on GBV, making linkages with abortion advocates, because there are abortion rights advocates in every country around the world. It's a matter of linking up with them and integrating them into the work that we're doing in meaningful ways, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So time is slipping away. What I'd like to do is just go quickly to Julia and Megan if you have any closing thoughts or answers to any of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. I'd like to leave just a couple of minutes at the end just to speak to what will come next for our members. So do please jump in. I don't know if either of you would like to go first.
Sure, I guess so I was quite involved with CCIC. I was on the board for 3 terms, and so have a big heart and lots of hopes for how CCIC is going to take some of our lessons and what we've done forward to the broader membership. And the thing that I would leave, which is sort of addresses some of the multilateral questions, and Lauren has said it, but I'll maybe just say it in a different way, or again to reinforce it. The sector-wide approach is a different advocacy approach. So when you're really looking, I don't know of a lot of other examples where the sector has said, we want to advance X, Y, and Z, and we think it's going to cost about this much to make a meaningful impact there. And Government of Canada, you can use all the tools in your toolbox. You can, the balance of multilat versus what money is going to go to X organization, like that needs to be worked out. But as a sector, we want to advance this forward. And I think when I think about the other big sectors that sort of are at play in the Canadian ODA envelope, I think that's a good approach to say, look, we're not saying that, you should give this percentage here and that percentage there, and we endorse this ask and we endorse that. We're saying we believe Canada has a niche, has a leadership pathways, is doing well on this. It needs to do more. It needs to do it, enhance it in this way, take this approach. Yes, needs about this much money. And now, use all the tools in your toolbox, from your World Bank investments to your diplomatic offices who are going to advance this, right? Because this is about leadership as well. It's not just about money for specific ODA projects. It's Canada saying, when the Prime Minister said, we will be the #1 investor in SRHR. To me, that's a huge opportunity to say, every diplomatic office is going to lead on this from an advocacy perspective. We're going to line up our foreign policy behind this in a way that's different, than we did before, because we're actually a leader in this space. And I think there's many other areas that Canada could do that, right? And could really take its leadership pathways and say, this is who we are, this is how we approach our ODA, and we're going to take a comprehensive approach. So it's kind of that sector wide, and all the, we talked a lot about what it took to get there, but it's slightly different. And part of it is about impact, but part of it is about just sort of maintaining that flexibility and thinking about where Canada can be a leader, period. Not just where Canada is going to invest its money, but where Canada can be a leader. So that was the only kind of comment that I had. And Megan, maybe you have other pieces that you want to add.
No, I think it's all been covered, also conscious of the time, but just sort of in closing, wanted to thank everyone again for the time today. An hour and a half, I know, is a long, as people are winding down for summer, but also just wanted to say, in terms of the policy, the accessibility of the policy platform itself, we very consciously and specifically didn't post it on a website because during the sort of advocacy towards a political commitment, wanted to make sure that there was room to pivot and make revisions if it was necessary and in the interest of the case itself. That being said, really happy to leave my email address in the box itself, and if anyone would like to have a copy of it and to dive deeper in, have a discussion about it one-on-one, really happy to make myself available to do that. So I'll leave it there, and thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you for that offer, Megan. That's fabulous. I'm sure there are many that will take you up on that offer. The reason that we wanted to have this conversation is because this is such a huge advocacy achievement. It's one that will have big impacts for our sector. It's one that hopefully different organizations can use in different ways, as you've indicated, in terms of our advocacy in different places. But I think that it's really important to look at how successful this was and some of the lessons. It's not a roadmap, it's not a blueprint, but there's a lot in here that tells us what are some of the ingredients that we need if we want to advocate for increases to ODA, which fundamentally uniting us all is the broader advocacy ask that we have. In so doing, it's important for our members to know that CCIC is working in that direction. We want to be working with you, and we'll be coming through different formats of convening the sector, trying to draw on these lessons and expanding our asks to other places. I think some of the things that really mark me in this experience are the time dedicated to the process, the time dedicated to making sure everyone felt included, the very sophisticated efforts in terms of the government relations track, and you know, trial ballooning, not finalizing a document, but allowing room for progress. I'd say there's one thing that also hasn't been raised specifically, and that's that there was really an investment in people who were thinking about advocacy from a sector perspective. And we don't, unfortunately, have a lot of that in our sector. And I think it was really one of the successes in this space was that you had people like these amazing women that have joined us that had spent time specifically thinking about the sector as a whole and how it could advance in a specific area. And we too often, I think, find ourselves doing advocacy or communications in a sort of business development lens. And so some of those investments that were made to actually put people in a position to advocate for all, I think made a really big difference. And I don't think that's something we should lose. In terms of the relationship that we want to build and expand our lens, we really do need other champions and advocates. I draw really interestingly from this the way that multilaterals were brought in as not typically viewed as partners of civil society in an advocacy pitch. And I think that this is really significant. And CCIC will be actually specifically trying to start to build investment cases for other subsectors. Expect that to be coming. And expanding our lens of relationships. One thing I want to make sure people have on their schedules and calendars is at the end of November, November 27th and 28th, CCIC is somewhat cannibalizing our traditional annual conference to create and launch, hopefully incubate, what will become a summit on Canada's global leadership. It's really intended to bring together folks from the trade, diplomacy, aid, and even security spaces so that we start to have the conversations about where our Venn diagrams overlap of shared interest in terms of Canada's global leadership. And so we will be building various pieces. You'll expect some of the CCIC member content at that conference to actually speak specifically to how can we be talking about the next 4 and 5 years of advocacy from a broader ODA perspective. We don't have all the answers, but we're going to be committing to working with those champions in the sector that want to work with us to actually advance progress in different areas. With respect to the election that's coming, it's looming for many. So I just want to flag that we are actually hosting another webinar on July 18th, specifically about advocacy regulations and the election. And it will be taking place from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. And there will again be there'll be an opportunity for exchange as a part of that. We'll be collecting information from the members that are doing things in the election. And we will actually be following up with those who choose to actually have a more comprehensive exchange with respect to respective strategies, how those overlap, things we should be keeping in mind. That webinar, just as this one, will have a French summary with it. So that's on July 18th anyway, you can find it on our events page on our website. I just want to close with a huge thank you to everyone who stuck with us. That's really an amazing attendance for this. And I think as I thank our amazing champions that joined us, I want to congratulate you on an amazing effort and amazing outcome, which I think is shared by the sector. Even with all the questions looming, it's really a great achievement. And so congratulations to you, and thank you very much for taking this time to be with us today.
Thank you so much.